Today on the Compliance Leadership Lounge.
They're incredibly important, both to learn from mentors and have mentors in your life, as a lawyer as it is. But certainly for something like M&A, it's a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle, right? Mm-hmm. Taking that proactive approach early on to always take compliance seriously and learn within your organization what needs to happen and always keeping your eye on it. That is time and resources well spent.
Sure. You can't walk in the door and talk to a board member about a big legal or compliance issue if you don't even know what the business does.
I think rewarding for me, I've had to reinvent my skill set a couple times in my career, which can be daunting, but it's ultimately rewarding because you're keeping yourself fresh. You're learning how to think on your feet a little more, dig deep on things you need to dig deep on. I think for buyers who are more sophisticated, a lot of the time they have to cut through a lot of noise and focus in on what the most important information they're receiving is.
Welcome to the Compliance Leadership Lounge with host Ross Ronan, your guide for insightful discussions in healthcare compliance. In our lounge, leaders and experts gather together to share their perspectives and wisdom. So grab a chair, make yourself comfortable, and join the conversation as we dive into the strategies and stories behind effective compliance leadership. Whether you're a CEO, board member, or a compliance enthusiast, you're in the right place to learn, grow, and lead with integrity.
Welcome, Carl, to the Compliance Leadership Lounge. Thanks for coming in today.
Thanks for having me, Ross. Excited to be here.
Can't believe we just were talking about this before we got on, that how long we've known each other. What, 18 years, I think, is where we're at.
Yeah, beginning of 2006. It's been quite a while.
Young men at that time period. I'm still young and you're getting a little older, but that's a different story. Seasoned. That's right. Well, tell us about that season. Where'd you come from? How'd you get to where you are today? What are you doing right now? I'd love to hear your story.
No, thanks, Ross. So back when we got to know each other, we were both working for a diversified healthcare services company. And I had fallen into that a little bit randomly in the sense that I wasn't a healthcare guy at the time. I'd worked as a law firm associate for, I was in my 6th year. Mm-hmm. And the opportunity presented itself when they needed somebody with a securities and M&A background. And so I jumped on the opportunity and stuck with it in a couple different roles over the next 11 years. So first on the legal side, and then I moved over to the business side, all really on M&A, and then continued down the business path, non-legal roles for a few more years, and then went back. And now I'm a shareholder at Greenberg Traurig here in Denver in the healthcare group, doing mainly healthcare transactions.
That's great. I think it's probably pretty funny, and I've never really had a conversation about this, but we do a lot of M&A work with due diligence, going into different private equity groups, purchasing different portfolio companies. We come in and do a compliance review on them. But you were first M&A hire ever at that company that we started doing a lot of acquisitions and a lot of mergers in that time frame. And I didn't know, as the compliance officer or any part of that, what an M&A process was or how it went about. And I think I remember our exact first M&A deal that I had to fly up to Denver to go do some stuff on. But you really taught me a lot on the mergers and acquisitions side of it, because I didn't know what a deal was, what a data room was, what we were looking for on that standpoint. You guys just walked in and said, hey, we need some compliance due diligence on this and figure out what they have or what they don't have. Are there any risk factors? And I'm like, okay, yes, sir, I'm ready to go. But I had no idea what a transaction was.
Well, I think we learned a lot from each other, because we did, I think over the span of those years, I was there, about 50 deals. Yeah. So it was a busy time. And by the time we were all done with it, and I think we were both there for the long haul. We'd gone through a lot of deals together and probably gotten a lot of inputs on how we like to run the process, and both on the compliance side and the M&A side.
I'm glad we got to fumble through it together, and nothing broke. So that was really good. Yeah. At least not what we can talk about. So this is a Compliance Leadership Lounge. We talk about leadership. We talk about different ways that executives and leaders and board members can learn from others or different people in the industry. One of the things we always start off with is, what's your favorite book? What's your favorite experience? Who's your favorite mentor? Whoever it may be in the leadership realm that really got you to where you are today.
Yeah, well, I can certainly go into some depth on mentors because I've been fortunate to have a lot of mentors along the way, and I think they're incredibly important, both to learn from mentors and have mentors in your life, and also give back at some point and be a mentor yourself. And sometimes the two go, you might be both at the same time, depending on what you're doing. Yeah, exactly. In terms of, so we can certainly talk about mentors because I think it's a big topic. I was thinking a little bit ahead of time on leadership books, and I'm not a big leadership management book kind of guy, but I do draw a lot from history. And I like reading history books or biographies in history or history related books. I think one of the more interesting people to dig in deep on is Charles de Gaulle. And there are a lot of interesting biographies on him. One that jumps out at me was one called An Explanation of de Gaulle, which was written in the 60s by a French historian, and it went on by Robert Aron, and it really was towards the end of de Gaulle's presidency and shortly thereafter, the end of his life. What I like about drawing from history, as opposed to sort of checklists of things you can do to be a better manager and that kind of thing, is those roles are so exposed. They're so public. So we see them warts and all, and we see how even the most qualified leaders throughout history and who've left an impact on history often fumbled through things, had their own issues along the way that they had to overcome, and often for the rest of the world to see. So I think it's an interesting thing to see it against the chaotic backdrop they were often dealing with, that they could still provide leadership in specific situations.
And that kind of chaos is a little bit different than we have chaos today with people like overthrowing governments and presidencies and things like that, right?
So it's but even then there was a tumultuous time, right?
For sure.
In the 60s and in that part. So drawing from something like that, I think, is interesting. And there are actually a number of books out now that are interesting too, that are kind of on my reading list, but that's with the benefit of 50 years of hindsight, where I think history has a tendency to reveal itself in a different light.
Oh, that's great. That's great. First one to ever reference history. So I like that. We've had basketball, we've had different athletics. So I like the fact that we detailed down to history. So that's awesome. So you've had an impressive career. We talked about you being legal counsel, going into non-legal roles, and then back to kind of partnerships in the legal industry. When you talk about that, what were the biggest kind of challenges you saw from, shifting from each one of those kind of career paths? Yeah. What are your biggest challenges when it came to that?
I think the easy part to it is 50% of my job felt like it was transferable at any given time, right? So you start a new role. It's all either in healthcare, it's within healthcare M&A or within M&A, and you build on from one onto the next, right? But that also means that 50% is not transferable. So each time you had to reinvent yourself and learn to some degree, not new substance necessarily, although there was some of that. When you go from the legal side to the finance side or the business side, you really have to get more of a finance mindset and learn some of the nitty gritty on finance that you might not have dealt with in that level of detail before. And certainly how each position is run differently. You set up your day-to-day is different from being an in-house lawyer to being an M&A professional to being a partner in a law firm. They're all set up differently. So each time you're kind of reinventing yourself. So it's both a challenge, but it's also something you can draw from and keeps you fresh.
Well, kind of going into that non-legal realm, because a lot of lawyers, whether they're in-house or outside counsel or with law firms, which is generally outside counsel, do kind of have a natural progression to get out of a law firm or get out of the legal industry and get into business, finance, CEO, CFO, COO type of realms, right? And I know you had a stint outside of that as an executive. Tell us a little bit about how your legal training, your legal practice really prepared you for those non-legal roles.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. I think that coming from the M&A side of legal, which was really my core.
It's very business oriented, no matter what.
That's right. And a lot of the things you learn as an M&A lawyer that you can carry with you is deal process, right? Deal management. And you tend to be very process oriented as a lawyer as it is. But certainly for something like M&A, it's a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle, right? A lot of pieces have to fit. They have to fit in a certain order. So that's something that I've tried to keep developing, get better and better at, and carry with me in any role that I've had. So implementing that type of thinking to a deal process, often if you're looking at multiple opportunities at the same time, or if you're working on multiple deals at the same time.
It's interesting because when you do a deal and you're on the legal or compliance side of it, you get to deal with like a certain number of people, certain number of things, but deal counsel, it really does everything. But if you get into the actual deal making, that's not really part of the legal structure, or the legal diligence, if you will. I mean, you really do get to interact with different people like board members and CEOs at the very highest levels of the target company that you're dealing with, as well as your company, because everything has to be presented to a board. Everything has to be presented to the CEO for approval. So I'm sure that, in building that kind of experience level through being a lawyer and then transitioning to the business side of the M&A work really did allow you to build your leadership skills, build your communication skills to those executives, because, as we talk about here, is how do you talk to executives? How do you communicate with the highest levels of any organization so that you can communicate to them, give them your point that's clear, concise, and complete, and you don't send them off running crazy because you've said something, you're like, oh, I'm just kidding, that was not that bad, right? So I'm sure you have a lot of insight into that.
I think the communications thread runs through, when you think about it, really through all constituents, right? Because you have to be able to convey, think about if you're working under circumstances where there's time pressure, you have maybe multiple things going at the same time, and all those people that you're communicating with are in the same boat. They also have multiple projects going on at the same time and limited bandwidth at any given moment. So if you're not clear in your communication, it becomes chaotic really quickly. I have to be able to, and this was true on the legal side, this is true on the legal side and was true on the business side, I have to be able to communicate to my team members, people who are reporting to me or looking for me to help them on something, what I'm expecting and what I think needs to happen. I need to be able to convey that to peers within the organization, outside advisors, and now as somebody who works back in the law firm, to clients. Right? You're often taking this very complex body of law, something that the person who you need them to focus on the specific issue might not have a background in that area of law at all. And you're taking something that's often complicated and technical, and you're having to present it in such a manner that they can look at it and understand why you're taking their time to do it and why you have an action item around it. So I think the communication thing, and hopefully over the span of a 25-year career, you get better and better at it. Right.
And you never stop learning.
No, you never stop. Exactly right. You never stop. But it becomes more important over time, I think, because you look at it and go, well, I wasn't clear on what that person was trying to tell me, or I got mixed messages. And you try to draw from that and avoid the same problem yourself. Although, no question, it's a learning process and it doesn't happen perfectly until you've had some practice.
Well, there's a lot on the line, too, on an M&A deal, right? It's both on the seller side, the buyer side. No one really goes away happy ever, right? So, because that's why they call it negotiation, right? So.
That is one way of looking at it, but hopefully hopefully you have a willing seller and a willing buyer, and the ultimate outcome is something people want.
And it's risky, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that can go wrong, and at the end of it, and so communicating the right way at the highest levels and people to understand it is really important. So I totally get that. Speaking of that, the complexities of M&A work. What are the top compliance challenges you've seen? And I'm talking, when we talk about healthcare and healthcare compliance, it's very regulated. We know this. It's one of the top regulated industries in the country, behind finance and probably FAA, travel, whatever, airlines. What are the biggest compliance challenges you've seen in M&A work? Not specific, but just overall.
Of course. I mean, I think it's not only a complex body to deal with, it's also become more and more complex over time. The regulatory body's grown around it. And I think for a lot of companies, it's a learning curve, right? And they're finding themselves already stretched for resources, and now they have this additional layer of information that they have to take very, very seriously. So for smaller companies, making sure that they dedicate the adequate resources to stay on top of things, even if they only intend to do things the right way, staying on top of things so they know what the right way is. Right. I think that's a pervasive challenge that comes with growth.
Sure.
Right? I think for buyers who are more sophisticated, a lot of the time they have to cut through a lot of noise and focus in on what the most important information they're receiving is, especially if you're thinking, for example, on transaction diligence or whatever. How do you cut through the noise and get to the important stuff, and then work side by side with your team and your advisors to craft solutions to whatever issues come up? Not necessarily healthcare specific, but it takes on added importance in the healthcare space, just given the complexity of it all.
Do you focus on healthcare mostly, or do you do all across?
Yeah, I am predominantly healthcare. M&A is really my bread and butter.
I find it interesting, and you just brought this up. We talk about it a lot at Ronan Healthcare Compliance, especially when we do diligence, but really thinking about sell side prep, right, for an upcoming acquisition or someone who wants to go to market at some point in time.
Yeah.
We've actually helped a few companies like they're, hey, we want to get ready to go out to market here, but we know our compliance function is not where it needs to be, right? And we've helped them kind of build their programs to be able to, hey, this is what this is the elevation of your compliance program so that you don't see these issues. When you see those, and the other side of it on the buy side, I mean, we know what we see from when we do buy side due diligence and say, they don't have this, they don't have this, they don't have this. Are you seeing that same kind of thing where you're going into these organizations where you're like, hey, you're lacking in these areas? And if they would have done something on the compliance side of it, it would have changed the way that the whole deal would have worked?
And I think both from buyers and sellers, you can look at it and say, taking that proactive approach early on to always take compliance seriously and learn within your organization what needs to happen and always keeping your eye on it, that is time and resources well spent.
Sure.
And I realize that it's laborious and often expensive for somebody looking to do an outlay on those types of services, but it can have big impact, and you'd rather deal with those things up front. And not everything is a groundbreaking issue, right? Some things are best practices that are good to implement, and some things are legitimate. No, this is not the right way to do this, even if you think it is.
Right.
So I would say both on the buy side and the sell side that companies would do well to deal with that type of analysis early on and continuously.
This episode of the Compliance Leadership Lounge is brought to you by Ronan Healthcare Compliance. At Ronan Healthcare Compliance, we believe in transforming healthcare compliance from a checkbox attitude to a strategic advantage. With decades of expertise, our team provides innovative solutions tailored to your organization's unique needs. We don't just help you meet your standards, we elevate your business, ensuring ethical practices are at the heart of what you do. Whether you're navigating complex regulations or seeking to enhance your compliance strategy, Ronan Healthcare is your partner in achieving excellence in healthcare compliance. Ronan Healthcare Compliance, redefining compliance, empowering leadership. Visit us at ronanhc.com to learn more. Now, back to the show.
Are you seeing a lot of really the decision makers, whether it's the CEOs or the boards, who want to get into a transaction, not on the sell side, but really buy side, and looking at strategics or looking at other types of portfolio companies within their organization? Are you seeing them really kick off with compliance due diligence before they do anything else, because it's more of a waste? If compliance goes wrong, right? If you have some sort of billing issue or something big that you have to deal with, like all the other diligence might not matter.
Right.
If it's big enough,
if it's something, yeah. No, and I would say that's not something that I typically see. I think diligence a lot of the time is done in tandem with different types of advisors. But that said, certainly with some types of very exposed subsectors, that type of initial compliance work is really crucial, right? And to your point, even if the time pressure's there and you kick it off where you have a couple of different work streams, or where a buyer has work streams going concurrently, spending some time on the compliance piece up front, which is pretty well defined, what you need to do, at least as an initial check.
100%. Yep.
Yeah.
It's very prescriptive.
Yeah.
Exactly what it is.
Yeah. And I've learned a lot from you in this regard on how that type of information, or, in the 20 years that I've known you, how you present that type of information in a way that is actionable. The same way we were talking about communication between various constituents. You're a compliance officer, you understand what all this means, right? but you're now presenting it to a business professional or sometimes even a lawyer who might not have that
Sure.
background, and certainly executive groups that don't have that same body of knowledge. And you have to present it in such a way that you say, this is why it's important. And a lot of the time, those are issues that take on a life of their own early on in a transaction, right?
We get involved pretty early in deals, which is makes sense because they wouldn't be calling me unless they wanted compliance due diligence. So of course we get involved, but we're seeing a lot more people call us first to see if they even want to do. Sometimes we even see it before an LOI is even sent out, which is crazy. I don't know how we get it done before then, and usually don't have access to anything before then, but sometimes that happens. And then sometimes it's really shortly thereafter because you have a time period to make a commitment, right? But it drives me crazy when all the diligence is done and they come in and they go, hey, let's do a compliance audit.
Yeah, no. And I think to your point, I think sophisticated buyers, acquisitive buyers, they have a process that's born from multiple transactions. So when they say, we're going to start diligence, and they don't, for example, start in a staggered way where they go, I'm going to start with compliance diligence because that's potential
QV compliance, but are the longest things that take the longest, right?
And a lot of time, if they get launched at the same time, they know that there's always the risk that you may have spent resources on something without really needing it because you had a deal breaker on something else. But the same thing can be said for a number of these different areas that advisors look into, right? I think on the legal side, what lawyers do in these transactions in healthcare M&A is related, right? I mean, a lot of the time, healthcare regulatory questions are ones that are part of the diligence, but may not have been covered in the same, certainly wasn't covered in the same manner, but may not have been covered as a subject area by your compliance review.
For sure. 100%. No, absolutely. Yeah. We need more education on that one for everybody. Just don't end with like legal and compliance diligence. Make it somewhere in the beginning because it puts a lot of pressure on you. Go, don't blow this deal like that. It is what it is. I'm sorry.
Well, look, with 25 plus years that you and I have been thinking about these things, I mean, you learn along the way what potential big issues are and to try to focus on those early, right? But
absolutely.
But I'm sure you in your compliance work represent a lot of companies and a lot of buyers who don't have that exact trajectory where they've been trying this specific type of deal for a certain period of time, right? So there's a little bit of learning along the way and how people stagger the process.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely something that everybody who's listening should take note of everything, how it should go and what should be done first. Let's talk a little bit more about leadership. So we often talk about compliance executives and compliance officers being more involved in strategy with healthcare organizations. And since you've been kind of a counterpart to compliance in your in-house roles and then being on the due diligence side of it and where you are today, how do you see like any compliance strategies aligning with business goals, or how would you see, or how would you advise any compliance leaders to really try to understand kind of the business goals and align what compliance should be?
Yeah, interesting question. I mean, I think that first off, I think it's bad for an organization that is looking to take compliance seriously, which they should, to silo off the compliance officer, the chief compliance officer, where it's sort of viewed that this person is outside the leadership team and they are there in a compliance function, as if that's really different than being a general counsel or a CFO or chief operations officer. I mean, I think they need to be part of that core team that is viewed in this with the same status, if you will, as their peers in the organization. So I think that's one important thing. And that doesn't just fall on the compliance officer. That really falls on the company. So all these things assume that a company is looking to do the right thing and wants a compliance officer, not just because they have to, but because they feel it's important to do the right thing and to have a great company. I think if you look at other specifics around it, we talked a little bit about communication earlier, and that's one where I think compliance officers can probably learn a lot in terms of thinking of who are they communicating with. Are they communicating with another professional in that space where they can talk in a very technical manner and really have the in-depth conversation, or are they speaking to somebody who doesn't have that background but needs to understand it anyway? And I think that is a skill set. I've seen you do this over the years, right? Which is extremely important, like knowing who you're talking to and who you're trying to communicate with, because you have to communicate it, and you don't want anybody walking away from that conversation not understanding what it is that you're, yeah, exactly, what you're trying to tell them. So I think that but inherently these things are technical, and it's very easy, just like it is if you're an M&A lawyer or a healthcare M&A lawyer. It's very easy to get lost in the details if you're trying to communicate something, but it has to be crisp enough that it's actionable.
And we talk often about compliance executives really having to understand the business.
Yeah.
Because I think it's really important,
Yeah.
as in lawyers or anybody else. I mean, even if you're doing an M&A deal, you have to understand, A, what the business is that you're representing that's buying, B, understand what the business is that is being purchased.
Yeah.
And a lot of that's not just the legal issues around it. And this is kind of where you were in the business side of
Right.
the M&A work, right? We often talk about the compliance executive understanding business and the operations of it so that they can really implement the regulations or implement the processes around the regulations for the company to be able to achieve its strategic goals, its growth goals, and anything associated with what kind of the business operations is.
Right.
We often talk a lot about spending time with, and the executive team. And I think the same thing happens with the lawyers and the general counsels and everybody else. You got to understand the business before
Right.
you can advise them on one way or another. What kind of strategies did you take from either being the legal department or being on an outside counsel standpoint where you've really tried to learn the business so that you can communicate with them effectively and get your point?
Yeah. When you say them, communicate with other constituents in the company, or
communicate with the CEO,
yeah.
the CFO, the board,
Right.
Understanding, hey, you can't walk in the door and talk to a board member about a big legal or compliance issue if you don't even know what the business does or how it's done.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's one of the big things I took away from my time in-house. Before that, I was not a healthcare professional, right? And then after I joined, and after I spent a lot of time in-house, I spoke that language, right? And that was extremely important, because that again goes back to the communication, but it also goes to the quality of your own work, knowing these are the issues that I have to govern, and especially in an environment as complex as healthcare and as regulated as healthcare. So I'd say I got my first big introduction and into that world as soon as I went in-house, because before that I'd worked across a number of different industries, and when I was doing it in-house, I had to think about this from how am I aligning the objectives of the transaction with the objectives of the company, right, and the business of the company. So I spent a good amount of time early on doing that, and I don't think I would have been able to make the leap to the business side after several years of doing that had I not had the industry background where I'd learned the industry. And now what I take with me is all those years I spent learning that, first as a lawyer and then as a business guy, I could transition back into private practice.
And it makes your private practice even stronger, right? Because
I think so.
you know how to listen. I think that's the biggest key, is sitting down, closing your mouth, listening to somebody talk about what the business is and what their strategic goals are.
That's right.
So it's really important to just know when to be quiet.
Yeah, and also having been a client myself, right? So I spent a lot of time over the years working with outside counsel, and in my role now, I look at something and go, well, if I were the client, is what I'm doing now something that I would be happy with? And I have to take that with me every step of the way. And I think that's one of the perks you get. You learn an industry, you learn how to do it from almost the client's point of view, and then you can take that back out in your outside role. And I think it makes your perspective richer.
It's huge. I mean, all aspects of everything that you've done in a career is get you to where you are today, and the experiences and being able to communicate to people, to understand how you do things. Speaking of that, what's your, and don't bash any of your previous jobs or anything else, but the most rewarding part of your career when you think back on it? And what's really interesting is I've been to a few seminars lately and really listened to a lot of people talk about leadership. And one individual, this kind of goes to the mentorship part of it, but one individual I listened to said, make your breadcrumb slide. And I was like, what's breadcrumb slide? And he's like, okay, so list out all the people that got you to where you are today. Yeah. As little as it could possibly be from the beginning of time. What did they do to get you there? And then make sure that you are on somebody else's breadcrumb list.
That's a great perspective, right?
Right.
That's a great way.
And he went through, this is Ted. And Ted got me my first job at doing this. And this was Ron. And Ron promoted me from manager to executive, right?
That's right.
So the biggest kind of rewarding aspects of your career can be something like that, or it can be something like, hey, I had the opportunity to travel, to be somewhere else. What's the biggest opportunity?
Yeah, I think it does touch on two things, both what's most rewarding and then in hindsight, the importance of those mentor-mentee relationships that we started with. I think rewarding for me, I've had to reinvent my skill set a couple times in my career, which it can be daunting when you do it and you decide to go into it, but it's ultimately rewarding because you're keeping yourself fresh. You're learning how to think on your feet a little more, dig deep on things you need to dig deep on. And I think it makes you a better professional coming out of it. So for me, that's been rewarding. It has not been a linear career. And by the way, I fully respect those who have had these amazing linear careers where they've built on one set of knowledge for 35 years and they are gurus early on, right? Because they've really honed in on the same thing for a long time. Mine has been a little different, but I think of it from an industry-wide perspective that I've had to reinvent myself in different aspects of the same industry. So they've been related. It's not like I'm going to being an artist, a street artist after being a lawyer or a professional athlete. Are you going to say I could do that too?
Yeah, you could.
Yeah, thanks. Appreciate that.
I'll tell you another quote I learned after that too. So go ahead.
But I think for me, that's been rewarding and it's kept things interesting, kept things fresh. And it's always forced me to have to think through what I want to accomplish in my role.
So just that constant change, that constant renewal of what you're doing, learning something new.
So along the way, I think that changing jobs between in-house firm and business roles, that's maybe more seismic. But even now, I'm really enjoying the ability to dig into new subsectors that I might not have worked on earlier on, right? So it's always important to keep things fresh and take on things, I think, that keep developing your knowledge and your base of information.
I love it. Couldn't agree with you more. I mean, change is always good, I think, for people like us.
Yeah.
And put us in the same boat. Change is always going to, make me want to do more, make me want to excel, make me want to grow.
And accelerate your knowledge. Right. And I remember you did the same thing. I mean, you went over to the business side for a number of years too. I'm sure some of these things sound familiar, right?
Absolutely. They resonate to me. That's why they're questions to you, Carl. So, well, as we wrap up, one of the things we always want to talk about with people is health is wealth, in our opinion, right? So what do you do to take care of yourself, mentally, physically, whatever?
Yeah, I could be hypocritical here and go into my workout regimen, which I've slipped from a little bit. I need to get back into fully.
A couple push-ups, pull-ups,
a couple. Yeah, I think that's fair. No, but in all seriousness, I do think all that is extremely important, especially if you have jobs that consume a lot of space, right? But I do think that for me, a lot of what energizes me is being able to spend real meaningful time with friends and close friends and family, right? One where I'm not just checking my phone constantly or jumping on calls, but trying to schedule in such a way that they have to see that up close enough, but also making sure that you dedicate some time to those people who are important in your life because you don't get that time back. And there are going to be times when I think it's better to get up, 2 hours before everyone else so you can spend the time you need at work so you can have some free time later, because these are demanding jobs we have, right? And when you have those demanding jobs, you don't want it to go out over the people that you care about in your life. So sometimes you have to juggle it to make it work. But I've always tried to do that. I try to do it in the outdoors to the extent possible because I find that also energizes me quite a bit. Anytime I can just enjoy the day in Colorado with those same with my family, or occasionally when friends come by from other places.
And you take them outside.
That's right. I take them outside. Yeah.
Well, Carl, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure. Again, we've had a long relationship, so it's great talking to you today.
Yeah, likewise. And thanks again for having me, Ross. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for spending time with us in the Compliance Leadership Lounge with Ross Ronan. If you've enjoyed our conversation, please subscribe, leave a review, and share this podcast with your network. Your engagement helps us continue to bring in-depth and influential content in the world of healthcare compliance. Stay tuned for our next episode where we further explore leadership dynamics and compliance. Until then, remember, effective compliance is about leading with integrity, and leadership is about making a difference.